Authorities in Washington have increasingly defended deadly military-style operations near Caribbean waters as part of a sweeping effort to stop narcotics from reaching the United States. Under the leadership of U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, the government has launched multiple strikes, including drone and missile attacks on vessels suspected of transporting drugs at sea. The administration argues that tighter border security has forced traffickers to switch tactics, turning to maritime routes to evade detection. According to this view, the surge in drug boats is not a new crisis, but a predictable reaction to stricter land and port controls. Yet this rationale has ignited fierce debate. Legal scholars, human rights advocates and members of Congress warn that using lethal force on suspected smugglers may violate international law, especially when survivors are targeted. On the 2nd of September 2025, a U.S. military aircraft struck a vessel in the Caribbean carrying 11 people, suspected members of a drug trafficking network. The first strike destroyed the boat. Hours later, a second strike reportedly killed 2 survivors who had clung to the wreckage. Both were unarmed and had no visible communications devices, according to sources briefed on the evidence. Survivors had been observed waving for help, attempting to right the damaged hull. Despite this, a follow-up strike ordered by Navy Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley was carried out. Officials say the survivors could still be in the fight, possibly calling for reinforcements or other boats still carrying drugs. Secretary Hegseth has publicly defended the decision, stating he would have made the same call. He rejected media reports alleging he ordered the operators to kill everybody. He recalled that he left the command post soon after the first strike and only later learnt about the second attack, which he says he fully supports. The Pentagon is now reviewing whether to release video footage of the operation. The confrontation has triggered widespread outcry. Some lawmakers describe the video evidence as one of the most troubling things I've seen in my time in public service, arguing it depicts the U.S. military killing helpless, shipwrecked individuals, a move potentially amounting to a war crime. Adding to the controversy, newly revealed materials from a classified congressional briefing show the destroyed vessel was not bound for the United States, but rather headed to Suriname, a known transit point for cocaine trafficking to Europe. This undermines the original framing of the attack as a preemptive strike against a direct threat to U.S. territory. Experts in migration and criminal networks note that smuggling across seas or borders rarely arises from demand alone. Rather, it often results from increasingly restrictive enforcement on land and at ports. When traditional smuggling corridors are blocked, traffickers adapt. The result, more desperate, dangerous journeys by sea or remote routes, exactly what US maritime interdiction forums are seeing today. In that context, some US officials view the new wave of maritime drug trafficking as a symptom of success, evidence that border control policies are working in the sense that smugglers are forced into more remote, harder to access channels. The dangers of such logic, critics warn, is that it can rationalize lethal force against vulnerable individuals and shift drug interdiction permanently into a war zone paradigm. Commentators argue that maritime drug trafficking remains fundamentally a matter of law enforcement, not military action. Under both U.S. and international law, people on board suspected vessels retain the right to life, due process and protection, especially if they are incapacitated, unarmed or shipwrecked. The lethal follow-up strike against survivors aboard a disabled vessel when no immediate threat was apparent has raised red flags. Killing wrecked or incapacitated persons breaches long-held norms in the laws of war. There is no evidence that those survivors posed an active kinetic danger. Instead, they appeared helpless and in distress, begging to be rescued, not destroyed. Legally, the justification for so-called self-defense becomes tenuous when the targeted boat is no longer mobile and when the threat was to a non-US destination. In fact, the destroyed boat's destination being Suriname, not the United States, undermines the earlier narrative used to legitimize the operation. Moreover, critics warn that the policy sets a dangerous precedent. It risks normalizing militarized interdiction against drug trafficking with minimal accountability and little transparency. Even if lethal enforcement can deter some maritime routes, it may also incentivize traffickers to further adapt using more covert, harder-to-detect modes such as submersibles, so-called narco-submarines, remote drop points, or entirely different paths. Some analysts caution that striking boats only sends the problem deeper underground. Drugs and people may still reach their destination through more cunning or riskier routes. History suggests that when legitimate channels are shut down, the black market adapts, often with greater brutality and risk. Indeed, proponents of a non-military law enforcement-centred approach recommend combining robust border controls with demand reduction, social programs, stronger policing and international cooperation. The recent burst of maritime strikes under Secretary Hegseth signals a major shift in US drug interdiction strategy from detention and arrest to lethal force overseas. For the first time in decades, the US appears to treat suspected traffickers as combatants. That shift comes at a cost. The combination of secrecy, some briefings are classified, lack of transparency, video evidence not yet released, and questionable legal justification has prompted bipartisan concern in Congress. Human rights groups warn that, if unchecked, the policy could erode international norms, normalize extrajudicial killings, and inflame diplomatic tensions, especially with countries whose waters or coastal regions may be affected. On the domestic front, it raises uncomfortable questions for a nation that battles its own drug overdoses and addiction issues. Is militarization the answer? And can lethal interventions at sea counteract the root causes, demand, poverty, corruption that drive trafficking? When an official says drug smuggling by boat is a symptom of success because borders are closed, they are arguing something specific. Enforcement is having effect. Stricter land border controls and port inspections are pushing traffickers out of those routes. Smuggling is adapting. The shift to boats or sea routes is less a sign of growing criminal power and more evidence of displacement. Justification for force by painting maritime smuggling as a byproduct of closed borders. It tries to rationalise aggressive countermeasures at sea. But this logic is deeply contested. Critics argue that such framing risks obscuring the human cost, erasing legal protections, and treating drug trafficking as a battlefield rather than a crime problem. Whether the governments involved, including the US, publicly release the video footage of the September strike, transparency here could be a turning point in public debate. Congressional investigations, there are growing calls from both parties for accountability over the follow-up strike and whether it violated US or international law. Potential shift in strategy by drug traffickers, more submarines, underwater containers, remote drop points, anything to avoid surface vessels vulnerable to detection. International response? Coastal countries, especially in the Caribbean and Latin America, may push back against unilateral US maritime strikes in their waters or involving their nationals. Policy reconsideration. Some lawmakers and experts are arguing for a return to law enforcement-centred approaches, seizures, arrests, prosecutions, rather than lethal force.